A desperate mother, a terrified child, and a dangerous man who decided they belonged to him. The old warehouse district in the southern industrial quarter of Brooklyn was utterly still at 11 o'clock at night. Connor Vega had learned very early that silence was rarely peace, and was more often the herald of danger waiting in the dark. He had not expected to find a woman bruised and torn, and a small son trembling and hiding behind a large shipping container in the yard behind his warehouse. He had not expected, when he looked into the wide, frightened eyes of that child, to see the same stare he had carried at 5 or 6, standing on the sidewalk and watching his father die after a cold daylight shot. He had never expected to care. But the instant he saw them, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whoever had raised a hand against them would soon learn what it meant to pick the wrong target. Under his roof, they were already his. Connor stepped out of his black sport utility vehicle, the leather of his shoes whispering against the cold concrete in the hush of the night. The late autumn wind cut at the collar of his long coat and carried the smell of rust and engine oil and something else, a low unease as if someone in the shadows were holding their breath. He moved past rows of containers stacked like steel walls, his gaze cold and scanning each dark corner as if the darkness might speak to him. Connor did not believe in coincidence. He trusted instincts, and his instincts were screaming a warning. Someone was here. Not his men, not his people. Something more fragile and more afraid. He stopped beside an aged blue container, the distant streetlight too weak to reveal everything but strong enough for him to hear a small, broken sound, halting and choked. The sound of someone trying to keep from crying because they knew that if they let it out they would pay for it. Connor signaled without words, and Jaden, his close friend and loyal right hand, fell back, to stand quietly behind him. He stepped forward, his voice low but authoritative. "Come out." The crying ceased. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. "I know you are there," he said slowly. "Come out. Right now. I will not repeat it a third time." A woman's voice answered, hoarse and shaking. "We did not take anything. We only need a place to hide for one night. Please, please do not hurt us." A figure lurched out from behind the container, a woman clutching a small body to her chest. The weak light was enough for Connor to see her face. One side swollen, dried blood matted in her hairline, a coat ripped to tatters, one leg favoring as if she had fallen hard. The boy, about 8 years old, pressed his face into his mother's shoulder, one arm hanging at an odd angle. Connor closed his hand into a fist, emotion heavy and hot, anger threading through the protective numbness he carried. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice dropping but ringing like metal. The woman stepped back and hugged, the child tighter. "No one. We are okay. We will leave now." She turned to go and staggered, nearly falling. Connor reached out instinctively and she recoiled. "Do not come near me. I beg you." He stopped and let his hands fall open to show he was not a threat. "You can barely stand. That boy looks like he is in terrible pain. If you want to be alive in the morning, you need help. We do not need, you do." Connor cut her off, his eyes never leaving the child, shaking in small spasms. "My name is Connor Vega. This is my warehouse. If you come into my territory, I become responsible. Old rules. I do not break my own law." The woman looked at him, skepticism and exhaustion mixing in her gaze. The boy made a small, painful sound, and her resolve softened. "Just one night," she whispered. Connor nodded once. "One night," he repeated. But inside he already knew, from the moment he met that boy's eyes, that they were no longer strangers, and he would not let them go until whoever had done this had paid. If you are still listening at this point, thank you for staying with this story, a journey that began in darkness but slowly revealed the fragile light within the human heart. And if something inside you was touched, even just a little, then perhaps this story has done what it was meant to do, to connect people through genuine emotion. We tell stories like this every day, stories drawn from life or inspired by it, not merely to entertain but to stir something deep within the listener's soul. If you wish to walk beside us a little longer, do not forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this story with someone you care about, someone who might also need a reason to believe in something again. Where are you listening from? Which city? Which state? Which country? Leave a comment below and let us know, because every comment is a thread that widens the circle of hearts beating together. We truly want to know how far this story has traveled, and how it made you feel when you heard it. Thank you for listening. There are still so many stories waiting to be told. The black SUV moved quietly through the empty midnight streets of Brooklyn like a shadow carrying two broken souls clinging to their last glimmer of hope. Connor sat in the front seat, his hand steady on the wheel, eyes on the road but ears tuned to the faint breaths behind him. Jaden was driving, silent, because he knew that when Connor went quiet, it was never peace. It was the calm before a storm compressed within. In the back seat, the woman held her boy close, shielding him from everything, even from sight itself. She had not said her name, had not asked where they were going, only nodded when Connor told her he would take them somewhere safe. For the first time during that long stretch of road, Connor turned slightly. "The boy's arm doesn't look right," he said, his tone neither cold nor hurried, but impossible to refuse. The woman lowered her head. "He hasn't cried from the pain, but I know it looks dislocated. I don't know." Her voice was raw, as if she had swallowed too many sobs. Connor pressed a button on his phone. "Ford, I need you at the West Safe House. A woman with a head injury and a fracture, a child about 8 with an arm injury. No report, no record." On the other end came only a short answer. "On my way." The apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an unmarked building in an old neighborhood, with an abandoned parking lot behind and a half-shuttered auto shop in front that opened only 3 days a week. Connor's safe houses were always like that, places no one noticed but where everything inside was in perfect order. He opened the door and switched on a soft light, enough to see but not enough to sting weary eyes. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with a couch and a few pillows. On the table, a few boxes of stored food, some folded clothes, and a landline with no connection to the internet. The woman stepped inside hesitantly, her gaze following Connor's every movement, as though trying to guess when the door might slam shut and the trap would spring. Connor said nothing. He simply removed his coat, hung it neatly, and went into the kitchen. He poured 2 cups of warm water and placed them on the table beside the couch. "You can change. Left room. There are clean towels and antiseptic. The doctor will be here in 10 minutes." She looked at him, distrust flickering in her eyes, but finally nodded and led the boy into the room, like a stray cat finally allowed through an open cage. When the door closed, Connor exhaled slowly. Jaden stood by the entrance, his eyes questioning, "Are you sure?" Connor only nodded. The boy's eyes still echoed in his mind, a reflection from a past that had never quite healed. 10 minutes later, Dr. Ford arrived, a man past 60, with graying hair and a worn medical bag that had followed him through countless secret calls. He asked no questions, made no judgments. He nodded once to Connor and went straight inside. When he emerged, his expression was heavy. "She has a cracked rib, signs of concussion, swollen eye, split lip, sprained ankle. The boy's left shoulder is dislocated, and there are older bruises." Connor did not ask for details. He could read between the lines. This was not the first time. The doctor administered painkillers, bandaged wounds, gave quiet instructions, and left without another word. Inside the room, the boy's arm had been secured in a soft sling. He was asleep now, his small face still wet with tears, but for the first time free of fear. The woman sat beside him, one hand resting on his chest, as if to make sure he was still breathing. Connor stood in the doorway, not stepping in, letting only his gaze rest on them like a silent promise. She did not ask his name, but for the first time, she spoke without the armor of fear. "Thank you," Connor nodded, his reply little more than a murmur. "Under this roof, you and your son are safe. And I will not let anyone break that." In the dim amber light, the man known as the most dangerous in the city stood watch over 2 fragile lives he had not even known existed hours before. But from the moment he brought them across that threshold, they had become his, and no one, no matter who they were, would ever make them afraid again. After Dr. Ford left, the apartment sank into quiet stillness, broken only by the faint tick of the clock and the soft breathing of a child newly bandaged. Connor stood in the small kitchen, a glass of water in his hand, his gaze fixed on the half-closed door leading to the bedroom. He heard nothing from within, and that silence weighed on him in a strange, heavy way. The woman, who still had not spoken her name, carried an alertness in her eyes, as if at the slightest wrong move she would vanish with her son forever. But Connor had no intention of doing anything that would make her run. He had seen enough to understand what the 2 of them needed most. Not another round of questions, not pity, but a sense of steadiness, something familiar and warm enough to let them loosen the strings of fear that had been wound too tight for too long. Connor opened the cupboard, took out a bar of dark chocolate, a pouch of whole milk, and a pinch of cinnamon. He stirred them slowly over low heat, every motion deliberate, almost ceremonial. The rich scent of cocoa began to spread through the kitchen, mixing with the amber light to create something rare. A place once cold and empty now felt like the kitchen of a real home. When the drink was ready, he poured it into 2 white porcelain cups and set them on the table. As if drawn by an invisible thread, the bedroom door creaked open, and the boy stepped out, barefoot on the cool wooden floor. He wore an old but clean t-shirt, his right sleeve rolled high to avoid the soft sling on his arm. His brown hair was tousled, his face streaked with dried tears, but the terror in his eyes had eased. Connor said nothing. He only pointed to the chair across from him. The boy glanced around, eyes flicking toward the door and window, before he moved carefully forward, sitting down with the wariness of a small bird, unsure if the branch could hold its weight. "Tyler," the boy whispered, almost too softly to hear. Connor gave a slight nod. "Connor," he replied, "hot cocoa. Family recipe. No sugar, but real chocolate and a touch of cinnamon. Helps you sleep." Tyler looked at the cup, hesitated for a few seconds, then lifted it with his good hand, blew on it, and took a sip. His eyes widened for an instant, and though he said nothing, his lips pressed together as if to hold on to the taste. Connor did not ask anything more. He simply sat across from him, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the hallway where the boy's mother still hadn't emerged. Tyler took another sip and murmured, "Mom's cleaning the blood. She said she doesn't want to stain the clean blanket." Connor's mouth curved slightly, not in amusement but in quiet recognition of a sad truth. This apartment is meant for people who need a place to rest. The blanket doesn't matter as much as the person under it. Tyler nodded, his eyes beginning to soften. Connor studied him and saw the same things he had once carried as a child, the exhaustion of someone forced to grow up too soon, the constant vigilance that had no place in an 8-year-old, and that desperate, fragile longing to believe someone might truly be on his side. The windows lock from the inside. The main door has 3 bolts. No one can get in without a key. Connor spoke not as comfort, but as simple fact. Tyler didn't answer, only glanced toward the door as if to check. After a few minutes, the cup was half empty, and his small head began to nod. Connor stood, fetched a soft blanket, and when he returned, Tyler had already slumped forward, his good arm still wrapped around the cup, eyes closed. Connor leaned down, lifting him gently, careful not to touch the injured shoulder. The boy didn't stir, only sighed softly as if sinking into the first dream he'd had in a long time that wasn't a nightmare. Connor carried him into the room and laid him beside his mother. The woman was awake, her eyes open, watching everything. She said nothing, only looked at him, and in that look was something fragile and breaking the first thread of trust given to a stranger after too many years of betrayal. Connor gave a small nod. No explanations, no promises. He closed the door quietly, returned to the living room, and sat down with his own cup of cocoa still warm in his hands. That night, for the first time in many years, Tyler slept through until morning, and in that small apartment, a fragile seed of faith began to grow amid the ruins. Dawn had not yet broken. Brooklyn lay wrapped in a thick veil of fog as Connor sat alone before his laptop in the office, next to the safe house. He had not slept. Not because he could not, but because he did not want to. In his mind, the image of Tyler sleeping peacefully beneath a thin blanket, cheek pressed against his mother's shoulder, played again and again like a looped recording. Something about them held him. It was not pity. It was recognition, as if he had once belonged to that same fear, had known too well what that strained silence felt like, and once seen, he could not turn away. Connor typed a few commands, accessing a database known to only a handful of people. Jaden had left him a small flash drive containing a brief fingerprint scan taken from the cup the woman used the night before. Connor didn't like doing it, but he had learned long ago that to protect someone, he first had to know who they were and who might be hunting them. The name that appeared on the screen made him sit up straight. Emily Hart, born in Columbus, studied architecture in Ann Arbor, graduated with near-perfect grades. Once employed by a major design firm in Chicago, with a spotless record. No criminal history, no debts, no ties to crime. But there was something else. A faint mark in the marital file. Divorced less than a year ago. Former husband, Daniel Rourke. Connor narrowed his eyes. The name was familiar. Head of the Brooklyn South Police Division, praised as a symbol of law and order, a frequent presence on television. The picture of the ideal husband and devoted father. Connor remembered clearly an interview a few months ago, Rourke smiling for the cameras, holding a little boy with brown hair. The perfect image of goodness in daylight. Connor turned the screen and compared the images. There was no mistake. The boy was Tyler. Heat rose to his temples, not from deception, but from the sheer obscenity of it. A man who beat his wife and son and was still celebrated as the face of justice. Connor kept scrolling through the file. There were a few civilian complaints, all dismissed. One report of domestic violence, filed 6 months earlier, the complainant being Emily herself. But there was no follow-up investigation, no witnesses, no confirmation. The case was closed after 10 days for lack of evidence. Connor closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. A system he controlled. Women like Emily never stood a chance when the man who hurt them was the same man in charge of the report. He moved to the movement data. Emily had changed addresses 3 times in 8 months. Each stay short, each move hundreds of miles away from the last. She had withdrawn all her savings, cut off friends, quit her job, even changed her surname in a recent hospital record. And still, he found her. This time, she had run all the way to a different borough. But even after all that effort, he still found her, still beat her, still twisted his son's arm until it dislocated. Connor braced his hands on the desk, head bowed, eyes shut tight. He had thought he'd seen every kind of cruelty human beings were capable of. He was wrong. There was always another layer of rot when the abuser wore the mask of righteousness. And this time, the victim was a woman with eyes dulled by exhaustion and a child too young to already know how to shrink from a touch. The soft sound of a door opening pulled him back to the present. Emily stood there, a thin coat folded in her arms, her face pale but cleaner than the night before. She stopped when she saw him looking. "You haven't slept?" she asked. Connor didn't answer right away. He simply closed the laptop and pushed the empty chair across the table toward her. "I know who you are," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Emily froze, as if bracing for the moment she'd be thrown out, but Connor spoke again before she could react. "I also know who he is, and I know what he's done." Her eyes darkened. "So what are you going to do now?" Connor met her gaze without blinking. "Keep you and your son safe. And starting today, Rourke no longer has the right to touch either of you, no matter what badge he wears." For a few seconds she couldn't speak. Her fingers clenched around the coat as if she needed something to hold on to, but her eyes had changed. There was still fear, still doubt, but flickering faintly within it a trace of hope. And for Connor, that was enough to begin. Night settled heavily over the city, leaving only scattered lights and the wind moaning through the skeletons of old buildings. Inside the small apartment, everything seemed to have quieted. Emily had fallen asleep on the narrow bed, one arm draped across Tyler's body like an anchor holding him in place against the dark. Connor sat alone in the living room, a glass of watered-down whiskey in hand, staring at nothing. He thought the night might finally pass in peace. Then a scream tore through the stillness, raw and shattering. He was on his feet before thought could form, before hesitation could breathe. He ran straight for the bedroom. Tyler thrashed in his sleep, small legs kicking wildly, his face drenched in sweat and tears. His voice broke between sobs. Don't hit, Mommy, I'll be good, I promise, please." That tiny voice splintered the air like glass hitting stone, each word cutting through the man who stood there, helpless and furious. Emily woke first, gathering her son into her arms, whispering through trembling lips. "Tyler, it's me, it's Mommy, wake up, sweetheart. I'm here." But the boy didn't wake, struggling harder instead. Connor stepped closer, crouched beside the bed, his voice low and steady, softened to the rhythm of a heartbeat. "Tyler, you're safe now. It's me, Connor. You're dreaming. No one can hurt your mom anymore. No one's allowed to." Emily looked at him, eyes wide with confusion and gratitude. She had never heard anyone speak to her son like that with certainty and tenderness all at once, not as a stranger trying to soothe, but as someone who truly understood. Tyler shuddered, the crying slowing, his hand reaching blindly for something to hold. Connor extended his own hand and waited. After a moment, The small fingers grasped his, gripping tightly as if letting go would make the world crumble. The boy opened his eyes, gasping, scanning the room as though expecting the monster to still be there. "Where is he?" The question sliced the air. Connor tightened his hold. "He's not here. He'll never come here. I promise." Tyler swallowed his tears, voice breaking. "He said if I'm bad, if I make Mommy cry then." Connor cut him off firmly. "Tyler, listen to me. Everything he told you was a lie. You are not to blame for what he did to your mother. You're a child. You did nothing wrong. And you never have to be good to earn love." Tyler looked up at him, eyes brimming. But within them, for the briefest instant, something glowed, something that looked like trust. Emily couldn't speak. She only sat there, holding her son, her head resting lightly against Connor's shoulder, as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. Connor gently lifted Tyler from his mother's arms, letting the boy's head rest against his chest, one hand cradling the back of his neck in the way people hold something fragile that has already been broken. "I used to have nightmares like yours," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "When I was 10, I watched my father die right in front of me. I couldn't sleep for 2 years after that. Every night I saw it again." Tyler stirred against him. "So how did you make it stop?" Connor smiled faintly, his gaze drifting somewhere far away. "I learned to check the windows, to lock the doors. I learned to recognize when I was dreaming. And most of all, I learned that I wasn't alone anymore. Just like you now." The boy lifted his head, looking at him with a grave seriousness. "You're really here?" "I am, and I'm not going anywhere." Tyler rubbed his eyes, his voice barely more than a breath. "Thank you for believing me." Connor laid him gently back on the bed, pulling the blanket up around him. This time, the boy didn't flinch or resist. He simply breathed evenly and sank into sleep. Connor turned to Emily. She was crying, quiet tears that looked as if they had been waiting years to fall. He didn't speak, only placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "He'll never come near you again. I swear it." She didn't answer, but the small, trembling nod she gave was enough to tell him that in the middle of all the nightmares, someone had finally decided to believe his promise. And this time, he would not let anyone break it. The light in the bedroom had been turned off, leaving only the faint golden glow from the living room seeping through the half-closed door. Tyler lay still, breathing deeply, his face finally relaxed in rare, peaceful sleep. Connor leaned against the doorway, watching the boy for a long while before returning to the sofa, where Emily sat gripping a steaming cup of tea she had barely touched. For several minutes, neither spoke. The room was filled with a fragile kind of silence, not the tense kind that had hung between them before, but the quiet caution of two people once shattered, now searching carefully for what was still whole inside each other. Then Emily spoke first, her voice so low that without attention it might have gone unheard. "Thank you, for not walking away from my son, for not asking too much." Connor shook his head. "I used to be that boy, and I know there are questions that don't need answers, only someone willing to stay." For the first time that night, Emily looked at him without any defense in her eyes. "You were a child like that?" Connor leaned back, fingers loosely interlaced, eyes fixed on the wall as if looking straight through time. "My father was a driver. One summer night he stopped his truck for a cigarette and got caught between two gangs settling a score. One stray bullet. No reason, no warning. I was less than 10 steps away and watched him fall before he could say a word. My mother broke after that. She couldn't take care of me. She sent me to live with my uncle, my father's brother, a man who had never really been close to our family, but he took me in. He didn't ask questions, didn't complain. He just said, 'From now on, you're mine, and I don't let anyone touch what's mine.'" Emily stayed silent. The words sounded hauntingly familiar. She remembered that first night, when Connor had said exactly the same thing to her and Tyler. Now she understood it hadn't been bravado. It was an inheritance. Connor went on, his tone steady, detached, as though telling someone else's story. "My uncle was a hard man, worked in the underground freight business, with connections that weren't exactly legal. But he had rules, no betrayal, no hitting women, no harm to children. I grew up in that world, not by choice, but I learned one thing: if the world doesn't protect you, you learn to become someone who can protect." He turned to her. "Just like Tyler needs someone to stand up for him now." Emily lowered her head, clutching the cup tighter. I thought I was strong once. Before Daniel. The name came out like a cut, even though she tried to say it gently. Connor didn't interrupt. He gave her space. The first time he hit me was during our first year of marriage. Because I forgot to pick him up from work. Just one slap. No mark. No one knew. He apologized later, brought flowers, held me, cried. I believed him. Then came the second time. The third. There was always a reason. Always my fault. I was late. I talked back. I dared to say that Tyler needed peace. Her voice trembled. He started controlling everything. My phone. My email. My friends. My job. I stopped being me. I became a shadow. Always. Trying to predict where the next outburst would come from. I tried to leave so many times, but he always found me. Always dragged me back. And the last time... Her words broke. Her hands shook as she set the cup down. Connor didn't need to hear more. He already knew. But he asked softly, not to pry but to open a door. Why did you run farther this time? Emily lifted her head, eyes red but steady. Because of Tyler. Because for the first time he stood between me and his father's fist. Because I was afraid not for me, but for the look in my child's eyes when he saw my blood. I realized that if I didn't run then, I'd never get another chance. Connor sat quietly, something fragile breaking open inside his chest. It wasn't pity, it was respect. A woman like her, a mother like her, deserved protection not because she was weak but because she had fought too long alone. He nodded slowly. You don't have to run anymore. Not while I'm here. Emily looked at him. For a long moment. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Small, but real. And in that long night, amid the scars of memory still cutting deep, that smile felt like a silent vow that trust, once dead, was beginning to grow again. Connor woke before dawn. He always did. Since he was 12, he had known that nothing was ever truly safe, not even sleep. The apartment was still quiet, only the faint rattle of wind against the window, the ticking of a patient clock, and the fading warmth left from the night before. He stood at the sink, staring at his reflection. The face staring back was carved from stone, the jaw shadowed with stubble, the eyes rimmed with sleepless dark but fully awake. It wasn't the face of a hero, nor the face of a father. It was the face of a man who had lived too long in the gray spaces, where right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. And yet it was the same face that, only hours earlier, had knelt beside a frightened child and promised safety without hesitation. He was not a good man, but he believed in one thing: law. When Jaden arrived that morning with coffee and a stack of documents, Connor was already seated in the corner of the living room, an old leather notebook in hand, the one he used to write down thoughts he would never share aloud. Jay set the paper bag on the table without a word. He knew that when Connor sat like this, it meant his mind was lost in something that could not be untangled in a single dawn. How is she? Jay asked quietly. Connor didn't look up. She used to think being hit was normal. Jay said nothing, not because he didn't understand, but because he knew what Connor needed now was space to finish his thought. I listened to her talk, Connor continued, his voice low and steady, and all I felt was anger, not just at him but at this damn world. A place where a man in uniform can beat his wife behind closed doors and still walk out onto the street to be called a hero. Jay nodded. Slowly. So, what are you going to do? Connor didn't answer right away. He lifted the coffee, took a sip, and spoke at last slowly, as if reciting a law carved into his own blood. I don't care who wears the badge and who doesn't. I don't hit women. I don't touch children. And I don't let anyone else do it while I'm still breathing. If that means standing on the wrong side of the law, then so be it. Jay's mouth curved faintly, half amusement, half resignation. You always live by your own rules, Connor, to the point where even the real criminals are afraid to break them in front of you. Connor met his eyes. I don't expect people to be decent. I'm not naive. But under my roof, anyone who steps inside understands one thing: they're mine. And I protect what's mine. No matter the cost. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of something deeper than declaration. They were the marrow of the man himself. When Emily woke, sunlight had already slipped into the living room. She saw the two men sitting at the table, talking in a tone she couldn't fully catch, but she understood it wasn't just about her or Tyler. It was about something larger, something that lived beyond simple lines of right and wrong. Connor rose when he noticed her, pulling out a chair for her with unthinking ease. "You should eat something. I'll have real food sent over later." Emily sat, watching him in silence before speaking. "I don't understand you. You're not a cop. You're not some good Samaritan who happened to walk by. But you don't ask for anything from me. You don't pry. You don't push. You just stay." Connor was quiet for a few seconds before replying. "You don't have to understand me. Just know this. Once you and your son stepped into this place, you became my responsibility. You don't have to run anymore. Not while I'm here." She looked at him for a long time, not with suspicion this time, but with the gaze of someone who had fallen to the bottom and finally found a hand reaching down. It didn't matter if that hand was clean or covered in scars, only that it truly held her. And in that instant, amid unhealed wounds and unnamed pain, a fragile faith began to take shape. Not faith in the goodness of the world, but in one man who carried darkness behind him, yet stood as the only barrier between her small family and the merciless world outside. That afternoon, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of cold rain, but inside the small apartment, there was movement, a quiet kind of preparation, wrapped in purpose. Connor personally checked every window, every latch, every lock. He missed nothing, not even the smallest detail. Jaden brought in a hard-sided case of security equipment, the kind only professionals knew how to handle. Motion sensors were installed near the front door, able to detect movement within 5 paces. Heat sensors lined the hallway. The windows were reinforced with double locks and shatterproof film. Connor did it all without a word, no noise, no complaint. Every motion was deliberate and precise, as though he wasn't just locking a home, but sealing away the fear that had haunted the woman and child inside it. Tyler sat quietly in the corner, hugging a pillow, his eyes following every one of Connor's actions. He didn't ask questions, but his gaze no longer darted away like before. When Connor knelt to check an outlet behind the bookshelf, the boy finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Uncle Connor." Connor paused, glancing up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. It was the first time the boy had called him by name. Not that man, not silence, just 2 small words that pressed somewhere deep inside his chest. He turned fully toward him, keeping his tone even. "What is it, Tyler?" The boy hesitated, then pointed. "What's that thing?" Connor followed his line of sight to the small infrared sensor fixed near the doorframe. "That's a motion detector. If someone comes in without the access code, the system sends an alert to my phone and to Jay's." Tyler nodded, and something like relief passed briefly through his expression. Connor stood and moved closer, crouching to meet the boy's eyes. "You want to learn how to check the locks?" Tyler hesitated again, then nodded. Connor led him around the apartment, showing him how to test each bolt, how to turn the key the right way, how to tell ordinary sounds from strange ones in the night. Step by step, Tyler followed, his small hands still trembling but his eyes brightening. When they returned to the main door, Connor opened a small security panel mounted on the wall. "This is the control unit. See here 3 buttons. Green means safe, yellow means sleep mode, red means alarm. If anything happens, just press the red one and run to your mom's room. I'll take care of the rest." Tyler looked up, hesitant. "You'll come, right? If someone comes?" Connor rested a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "I promise. If anything happens, I'll be here before anyone else. Whoever they are, they'll have to get through me first." The boy said nothing more, just nodded. But from that moment on, he began to follow Connor whenever he made his rounds of the apartment. He asked more questions, watched more closely, and even started to help handing him screws, steadying the ladder, wiping the window frames. Connor never sent him away. He explained everything patiently, his voice low and calm, the kind of voice that made a person feel safe just hearing it. As the afternoon faded and night fell once again, for the first time since arriving at the apartment, Tyler stepped out of his room without his mother beside him. He sat down next to Connor on the sofa, eyes fixed on the small television. He didn't speak, just sat there, his tiny feet swinging lightly, his gaze calm and steady. Connor glanced at him once, then handed him a cup of cocoa. Tyler smiled, small, but real. "You remembered the cinnamon." Connor raised an eyebrow, pretending surprise. "You thought I'd forget?" Tyler shook his head, his eyes bright but no longer shadowed. No, I know you remember. And with that single sentence, Connor realized that what he was building wasn't just an elaborate system of locks and alarms to keep danger out. He was building a different kind of barrier, a stronger one made of trust, the rarest and most precious thing left in the world they lived in. The next morning, before dawn, Connor was already awake, while Emily and Tyler still slept. He stood quietly in the dim living room, the glow of the laptop casting cold light across his face. On the screen were files, documents, photographs, and internal reports all centered around Daniel Rourke, chief of the Brooklyn South Police Division, and Emily's former husband. The vague suspicions of the past few days had now taken shape, aligning into a picture of the man behind the polished badge. Jaden sat across from him, eyes bloodshot from staying up all night, holding his third cup of coffee. I had to break through 2 encryption layers and drop a gentle threat to a retired FBI hacker just to get into the personnel archives, he muttered, sliding the laptop toward Connor. And here it is, my friend, the truth those bastards tried to bury. Connor leaned in and read line by line. Internal complaints sealed away, anonymous tips from former colleagues, and worse, an internal affairs investigation that had been abruptly suspended for lack of evidence. At least 3 major scandals were tied to Daniel Rourke: physical assault during suspect interrogations, tampering with evidence in a 2014 homicide case, and a series of questionable budget reports from the narcotics unit he commanded. Every one of them had been stopped before reaching daylight. Several officers who tried to expose him were reassigned. One was fired, another voluntarily retired. Connor's jaw tightened as he reached that line. Jay continued in a low voice. He's not just a bad cop. He's a manipulator of the whole system. I've heard from someone in the prosecutor's office. Rourke has ties to at least 2 judges, 3 prosecutors, and 1 local politician. He knows where their weak spots are, and he keeps his grip on them like a knife. Connor leaned back, his eyes hardening to steel. What about his family history? Jay switched tabs, revealing strings of emails, tracking logs, and street camera stills pulled from their surveillance system. For the last 8 months, Emily's moved 3 times. Each neighborhood ordinary, each lease signed under a new name, each school transfer for Tyler handled carefully. But every time, he found her in less than 2 weeks. Rourke used his privileges to track school databases, utility accounts, even private hospital records. Nobody questioned it because he's the one who does the questioning. Connor's gaze didn't waver. And the last time, the night she ran and ended up at my warehouse? Jay tapped a key, bringing up a traffic cam image. 3:18 in the morning. A city camera caught Rourke's car parked near Tyler's school. He sat there for nearly an hour, then drove off. No patrol logs filed that night, meaning he was stalking. Connor rose, clasped his hands behind his back, and took a few slow steps across the room. He'd met men who killed without remorse, men who used fear, money, or bullets to control. But Daniel Rourke was something else entirely, a cancer disguised as law. A man who weaponized respectability, who hid his violence behind a uniform polished by the illusion of justice. He'll come back, Jay said. Not out of love, out of control. For people like him, losing Emily and Tyler isn't heartbreak, it's humiliation. He needs control. He lives. Connor's eyes met Jay's, sharp and deliberate. Then we'll take what he calls power and turn it into his downfall. Jay gave a faint, weary smile. And how do you plan to hit him? His reputation, Connor said instantly, his voice quiet but cutting like glass. I want every person who looks at him to see what he really is. I want his badge to mean nothing, his name to burn. I want to strip him of every ally, every illusion, until the only thing left is the truth he's tried to bury. Jay sighed. That'll take time. Connor picked up his black notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. I have time. She and her son don't. And as he wrote the first line of his plan, Jaden knew that Daniel Rourke would not be facing just an angry man. He had just made an enemy of Connor Vega, a man who lived by a code. And when that code was broken, he became the storm that no one could survive. Connor knew one thing for certain. To defeat a man like Evasawai, Daniel Rourke, strength and anger alone would never be enough. Rourke wasn't the kind to flinch at a fist or a whispered threat in a dark alley. Men like him feared only one thing: light, true justice. The kind not bought, not worn on a badge, not corrupted by power. That morning, After Tyler had left for his first therapy session with a specialist Connor trusted, and while Emily stood in the kitchen peeling apples, Connor entered his private office, opened his laptop, and called Jay. "Prepare the file package. Every piece of evidence we have on Rourke, legal and not so legal. I've got someone who needs to see it." Jay asked a single question. "You're trusting the law now?" Connor lifted his eyes, calm but unyielding. "No, I'm going to use it, like a knife. And I know someone who can wield it better than anyone." Her name was Elena Reyes, federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of New York, 39, Puerto Rican. The kind of woman who once brought down a state-level corruption ring with a single receipt and the testimony of a janitor. She was sharp, uncompromising, and known for never accepting bribes or backroom deals. Most importantly, she owed Connor Vega a favor. The meeting was arranged within 4 hours. Elena arrived at a small cafe in Brooklyn, wearing dark glasses and a long coat, her face bare of makeup but her presence as precise and cutting as a blade. When she stepped into the private room where Connor and Jay were waiting, she removed her glasses and looked straight at him. "It's been a while. I thought you'd walked away from all these power games." Connor didn't smile. He slid a folder across the table, along with an encrypted hard drive. "I'm still the same, but this time, it's bigger than me." Elena opened the folder, her eyes scanning quickly over pages, pausing at photos, internal memos, and the transcript of a leaked call between Rourke and a judge. After 15 minutes, she stopped, her hand resting on a photo of Tyler clinging to his mother, his arm in a cast, his eyes wide with fear. "This is her son?" Connor nodded. 8 years old, not afraid of monsters under the bed anymore. Now he's afraid of the knock on the door at midnight, because sometimes it's his father. Elena was silent. She was a prosecutor, she had seen the worst of humanity, but that child's face, that truth, couldn't be rationalized away. "What's on the drive?" she asked. Jay answered. Recorded calls, records from Rourke's secondary bank account, timestamps of his unauthorized data access, car surveillance photos, and camera extractions, all matching the times he stalked Emily Hart and her son. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Emily Hart? Her former name?" Jay said. "She changed it to Emily James when she went into hiding. Does she have a sworn statement?" "She'll testify if she's protected," Connor said, "but I won't let her go public just to be punished for it." Elena leaned back, silent for a moment. "I can escalate this to the federal level, but I'll need 3 things. A sworn affidavit from Emily, full confidentiality of Tyler's records, and you, Connor Vega, to stay out of it. If I take this on, I won't have it dismissed as a mob setup." Connor nodded. "I won't interfere, but if he gets close to them again, I'll handle it my way." "Outside the law." Elena studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "Fair enough." She slipped the drive into her coat pocket and put her glasses back on. "I'll initiate proceedings tomorrow morning. If things go as planned, Rourke will be under covert surveillance before we go public. Thank you for choosing this path, Vega." Connor gave a small nod. "Not for me. For us." When she left, Jay looked at him with a mix of respect and unease. "You just put the ace card on the table." "No," Connor said slowly. "I just gave the law a chance to prove it. Can still do what it was made to do. If it fails, I'll finish it myself." And this time, there would be no hesitation, not for power, not for pride, but for a woman who had learned to believe again, and for a child who was finally learning what it meant to sleep safely in his own home. That morning the sky was the color of ash, rainless, yet dark enough to warn that something was shifting, and Connor stood across the street with his hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat, his gaze cold and fixed on the headquarters of the Millstone District Police Chief. A crowd had gathered out front, curious citizens, a few reporters quietly readying their cameras, while the officers held their posts as if professionalism could hide their shame, and Connor neither spoke nor moved, though the air itself seemed to bend toward the gravity of his attention, until a black sport utility vehicle slid to the curb, and 2 federal agents in dark suits stepped out first, followed by Reyes, the district prosecutor, who gave Connor the smallest nod across the street, a wordless sign that everything was in place. The front doors creaked open with the heavy groan of old hinges that sounded like a warning bell, and Daniel Rourke was brought out in stainless steel cuffs, his shirt rumpled, tie askew, hair wild with a night without sleep, Yet it was his eyes, still arrogant and proud, that unsettled those watching, as if even in custody he believed himself untouchable. The crowd murmured, shutters clicked, but all attention gathered to a single point, the look between two men, Connor unmoving as if carved from stone while Rourke, hustled down the steps, turned and met his stare, and for a long beat there were no words, no gestures, only a gaze so steady it made time hesitate. And Rourke did not need to ask who had arranged all of this, and Connor did not need to explain, because the message was already delivered in that look. An ending, a warning, a declaration that needed no voice at all. I told you I would protect them. You have lost. Rourke's mouth twisted into a hateful half-smile that no longer carried any threat. Pride ground under the heel of his own self-confidence, and the officers pushed him into the car and the door slammed, snuffing out the last shadow that had kept Emily and Tyler living in fear. Connor still did not move, everything unfolding as he had designed it. Evidence woven with care, statements appearing at the right moment, trails of laundered money, domestic brutality, the manipulation of superiors, all hauled into daylight, not because he wished to destroy a man, but because he had promised a child that no one would hurt his mother again, and he kept his word. When the vehicle carrying Rourke rolled away from the steps, Connor finally turned and walked toward the quiet alley, where Jay waited in the car, opened the door, sat down beside him, and said nothing. Jay glanced at him in the rear view before starting the engine. He saw you, good, and he knows you were behind it, better, and they drove away, leaving noise behind with an old chapter closed. And for Connor, justice had been served not only in a courtroom but in that last exchange of eyes. And now there was only one thing to do. Go home to the small family waiting for him in the safe Brooklyn apartment, where a woman had begun to believe she was worthy of love, and a boy had learned that a father was not the one who gave him life, but the one who chose to stay. The apartment was unusually quiet when Connor opened the door, a quiet he knew from solitary nights, yet different now. The pulse of it was peace, not loneliness, and he hung his coat and stepped into the living room where Emily sat, curled on the sofa under a thin blanket, hair loose at her shoulders, her gaze hazy as if she had just woken from a long dream, the lamplight softening the strong lines of her face into a fragile kind of beauty. And when the door closed, she looked up without questions or words, and he nodded and came close and said in a low, rough voice, "It is done. He has been arrested. Publicly, he cannot run." And she did not answer, her mouth trembling as if one more word would break her, and he sat beside her without touching, a wall of steadiness. And she let the blanket fall and leaned into him at last, head to his shoulder as if she had carried too much weight for too long, and now allowed herself to fold. And tears slid soundlessly down to stain his shirt while she whispered, "We do not have to run anymore." And he drew his arm around her. "No, you do not. You are both safe." And she shook her head faintly as if unable to believe it yet. "I thought I would never get out, that he would always find me, that I would always have to hide. I have lived that way so long I do not know how to breathe without fear." And Connor only held her tighter, letting her fall into her own relief, until small footsteps sounded from the hall, and Tyler appeared with the old stuffed bear he held whenever worry rose. And he stood very still, and then hurried to the sofa and slipped between them as if he had always belonged. And Connor gathered him in, and the boy hugged him hard. "You did it. You stopped him." And Connor nodded. "Yes, he will never hurt your mother again, or you." And the boy rested his face against Connor's chest and then looked up. "So now we can stay. We do not have to move or change names or switch schools or leave my toys." And Connor's arm tightened with gentle certainty. "We stay. You can hang pictures in your room and shelve your books and choose your own sheets. This is your home, your mother's, and if you want, mine too." And the boy smiled. Not the thin, guarded smile of their first meeting, but a full, warm, certain smile. "I want it. I want this to be our home." And Emily wept again, this time for joy, her arms circling both her son and Connor. And for the first time in a long time, the rooms filled with soft laughter and long breaths, and the quietest vow of a heart that had come through storm. The next morning, Connor made hot chocolate for Tyler and pancakes in the small kitchen, while Emily watched from the doorway with a tender smile. And they spoke little because there are holy things that do not need words. They only need to be lived and felt and kept. And in that moment, hope was not distant at all. It was present, and tangible in the warm kitchen of a family pieced together from broken parts. Later, Connor parked in front of a 3-story brownstone tucked on a leafy Brooklyn street. His own house of brown brick that had once been only a stopover, and now was about to become a real home for 3 storm-tossed souls. And Tyler pressed his face to the window, eyes alight. "Is this our new house?" And Connor smiled. "Yes, if you still want it." And the boy turned to his mother, and Emily squeezed his hand and nodded. "We are staying. This is home." And they stepped inside to the scent of old wood and familiar coffee. The rooms warm with wooden bookcases, lining the walls, small family frames, and the amber glow of a vintage chandelier, the whole space radiating shelter and solidity like the man who owned it. And at the end of the hall, the back door was ajar, and a woman's voice floated in from the garden in a thick Italian lilt. "Connor, is that you? Who have you brought?" And a small figure with hair white as snow appeared at the threshold. Connor's grandmother, Nonna Maria Vega, in a flower-dusted apron with a wooden spoon in hand, and eyes narrowed as she studied the 2 who followed her grandson. Connor smiled and kissed her cheek. "Nonna, I want you to meet Emily and Tyler. They are my family." And for a moment Nonna said nothing, searching the weary but steady eyes of Emily, then looking down at Tyler, whose hand clung to his mother's, while his gaze shimmered with both hope and caution. And she nodded and beckoned. "Come here, little one. Do you like making cookies?" And the boy glanced at his mother for permission, and Emily smiled, and he edged forward, and Nonna took his small hand without another word and led him to the kitchen. "I will show you how to make biscotti the proper Italian way. It is not easy, but I can tell you are clever." And Connor and Emily exchanged a look and a quiet smile, because with Nonna there were no formal welcomes. If she let you into the kitchen, you belonged. That night the table stretched under a white cloth for a true feast. The old family dishes set out. Pastas and sauces Nonna had cooked, and a bowl of dough Tyler had helped knead, which he spoke about proudly through the meal. And Emily sat at Connor's side for the first time, not tense at a crowded table, every glance around her warm and kind, while Nonna told stories from the war years and her granddaughter Clara teased Connor for finally bringing someone home. And laughter rang against the walls, and glasses chimed, and the soft murmur of what had never been, but was becoming real, spread through the house. After dinner, while others tidied and talked, Tyler tugged Connor's hand out to the garden, where lanterns hung like small moons, and said in a whisper, "Today is the happiest day of my life." And Connor knelt to his height and set his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You deserve many days like this." And the boy wrapped his arms around him with sudden fierceness. "I feel like I truly have a family. I never knew it could be this real." And Connor held him close, feeling the small heart beating in peace. "We are a family, you and your mother and me." And when they walked back in, Emily stood in the doorway with shining eyes and needed no questions because there was nothing left to ask. Not when Tyler's hand was in Connor's, and the fear was gone from his face. That is what family is. A place where the heart comes to rest, where laughter softens the old scars, where wounds are eased by a love that requires no promises, and that quiet brownstone, silent for so many years, finally echoed with the sounds of a true home. It was an early autumn evening, and Connor's kitchen was alive with the warm scent of baked pastries and hot cocoa. Emily stood at the sink washing dishes, her hair loose and soft, a loose sweater draped over shoulders that no longer looked as fragile as the first day he met her. Tyler sat at the table, drawing while glancing at Connor with barely contained excitement. Connor gave the boy a small nod, an unspoken signal between the 2 men of the house. Clearing his throat, he stepped toward Emily, a neatly folded kitchen towel in his hand. "Take a break for a second?" She turned and smiled. "Sure. What's wrong?" Connor didn't answer right away. He crossed to the table, opened a drawer, and took out a small, time-worn wooden box. Setting it on the surface, he lifted the lid. Tyler slid off his chair, tiptoed behind his mother, and whispered, "Mom, look." Emily turned just as Connor opened the box. Inside lay a simple ring, plain gold, the band engraved with 2 tiny letters, E and T. Connor looked up, his gaze so gentle it made Emily freeze where she stood. "I thought about doing this the traditional way," he said quietly. "Restaurant, candles, flowers, down on one knee, but this is where it began. This kitchen where you made your first dinner here, where Tyler laughs more than anywhere else, where you once said you felt safe. Emily raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. Connor took the ring, stepping closer but not kneeling. He simply held out his hand. Emily Hart, you are the strongest woman I've ever known. You fought for your son, for yourself, and you never stopped trying. You trusted me. You trusted a world that once gave you no safe place to stand. Tonight, I'm not asking to marry you to save you. I'm asking because I can't imagine a life that doesn't have you in it. You and Tyler, you're my family, my everything. Will you let me call you my wife, and love and protect you for the rest of my life? Tyler held his breath, clinging to his mother's arm. Emily looked at Connor for a long moment, her hand trembling as she squeezed his. You don't have to do this, she whispered. I'm not doing it out of duty, Connor replied, eyes steady on hers. I'm doing it out of love. A tear rolled down her cheek. Slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter, she nodded. Yes, she said, voice shaking. Yes, I will, Tyler shouted. Yeah, it worked, and threw his arms around them both. Connor slid the ring onto Emily's finger. Her hand was cold, but when the gold touched her skin, the whole room seemed to grow warmer. Emily laughed through her tears. I suppose Tyler was part of this plan? Exactly, Connor said with a grin. He even wanted to hire a violinist. But I thought, Tyler mumbled, we don't need music in the kitchen. Because when Mom laughs and you talk, it already sounds nice. Emily crouched to hug him, then reached out to pull Connor in too. The three of them stood there in the little kitchen, holding each other, no longer just a place for cooking, but the beating heart of a family beginning a new chapter. Outside, the wind stirred the garden and rustled the leaves, but inside, time stopped. There were no grand speeches, no gestures for show, just love, quiet, unpretentious, real. A proposal spoken from the heart, accepted through tears of joy, and witnessed by the child who had once called a stranger uncle and now called him dad. Later that night, the house was still. The soft amber light from the living room lamp fell through thin curtains, tracing gentle lines across the wooden floor. Connor sat alone on the sofa, a cup of cold tea in his hand, staring into the quiet. Peace still felt unfamiliar. In the past, the late hours had always belonged to planning, to anticipating danger. But now, silence no longer meant threat. It was a reminder that under this roof, the people he loved were safe and asleep. Small footsteps approached. Connor looked up to see Tyler in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching a thin blanket, his eyes heavy with sleep. Connor set the cup aside and opened his arms. Couldn't sleep, buddy? Tyler climbed into his lap and curled against him like a kitten. I was thinking too much. About what? A lot of things, but one I really need to ask. Connor wrapped an arm around him, a quiet knot forming in his chest. Ask me. The boy looked up, eyes deep and serious in a way that hurt to see on an 8-year-old. I know. You're going to marry my mom, and I think that's really great. Connor smiled softly, pulling him closer. So do I. Tyler hesitated, then blurted it out in a rush, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve. If I wanted to call you Dad, would that be okay? Connor froze. His heart missed a beat. The simple question pierced deeper than any bullet he'd ever faced. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. Tyler, are you sure you mean that? The boy nodded, his small hand gripping Connor's shirt. I know you're not my real dad, but my real dad, he made Mom cry. He hurt her, he hurt me. And you make me feel safe. Like what a dad is supposed to feel like. Connor couldn't speak. He drew a long breath, closed his eyes, and for a moment it felt like everything inside him cracked open. When Tyler whispered again so softly it felt like a breeze across his heart, a tear slipped free despite him. I don't want to keep calling you uncle. I want a dad. And I want that dad to be you. Can I, Dad? The word dad, spoken for the first time from that small mouth, made Connor's world collapse and rebuild all at once. He opened his eyes and looked at the child nestled in his arms. Innocent, brave, and so heartbreakingly real. Yes, he breathed. God, yes, Tyler. More than okay. He pressed a kiss to the boy's tousled hair, still smelling faintly of milk and sleep. From the first moment I saw you trembling behind that warehouse with your mom, I knew I'd do anything to protect you. You don't have to call me Dad for me to love you, but if you want to, then I'll be your dad. In every way. Always. Tyler tightened his arms around Connor, his breathing slowing. I love you, Dad. Connor lowered his face into the boy's hair, voice thick with emotion. I love you too, son, so much. They stayed like that, father and son, in perfect silence. A man who had grown up in darkness now holding the brightest light of his life, and a boy who had once believed adults only caused pain, now learning to trust in love again. When the clock struck midnight, Tyler had fallen asleep in his father's arms. Connor didn't carry him to bed. He only adjusted the blanket, keeping the child warm, and sat still, afraid that any movement might break the fragile perfection of the moment. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside that small home where a mother slept peacefully and a child had just rediscovered something sacred, everything was steady and still, as if the storms of their lives had finally passed. And there, in that silence, Connor Vega, once a man who knew only darkness, finally understood what it meant to live in the light. On a peaceful Brooklyn morning, the early light slipped through the kitchen window and stretched across the table, where the three of them now sat as if by habit. Emily poured more coffee for Connor while Tyler wrestled with something he was writing on a sheet of paper, his brow furrowed and his tongue peeking out in concentration, as if he were carrying out a solemn task. Connor glanced at Emily and smiled softly. The kid looks like he is plotting something. Emily nodded, her eyes tender on her son. He said he had something to say this morning, so I let him prepare it himself. After a while, Tyler looked up and held out the paper, his eyes bright and resolute. I have something important to ask. Connor sat straighter and set down his cup. Go ahead. Kid, Tyler swallowed and spoke clearly. Now that I get to stay with Mom and Dad, Dad Connor is going to marry Mom, and I want to change my name. Emily went still, and Connor tilted his head. Change it to what? Tyler set the paper on the table. Across it in uneven child's letters ran the name Tyler Hart Vega. I still want to keep Hart. That is Mom's name, and I love Mom. But I also want to carry Dad's name. My new full name, if everyone agrees, is Tyler Hart Vega. Emily lifted a hand to her mouth, overcome, and Connor was quiet for a moment before he reached for the paper and read it slowly as if each letter were sacred. Tyler Hart Vega, he said and looked at the boy. Are you sure? Tyler nodded hard. I have thought about it. I do not want to forget the past, but I also want people to know I am part of this family, of Dad and Mom. Emily turned to Connor, eyes already shining. I did not think he would want that so soon. Connor squeezed her hand lightly. He knows better than anyone what makes him feel like himself, and if that name is how he claims it, then we only need to stand beside him. He turned to Tyler, his gaze firm and warm. Family is not always made by blood. Sometimes it is made by choice, and you chose me. I choose you. Every day. Always. Tyler left his chair, ran around the table and threw his arms around Connor. Thank you, Dad. I love you. I love you too, kid, and I will be very proud to see you sign Tyler Hart Vega on every test. Emily rose and wrapped her arms around both of them. Our family is a strange one, she whispered. Strange but right, Connor said, pulling her into the same embrace and holding tight as if to shield the most precious thing in his life. The next day, the three of them went to the lawyer's office to start the name change. When the clerk asked for the boy's full name for the form, Tyler lifted his head, and after a tiny pause, smiled with pride. Tyler Hart Vega. I want that name forever. Connor looked at Emily and their eyes met, and then both watched Tyler sign the statement in a young but steady hand. From that moment a new chapter opened. They were no longer people on the run, no longer only protector and protected, but a real family bound by love, by choice, and by the courage to begin again. Connor left the office holding Emily's hand in his left and Tyler's in his right, and the boy looked up with clear eyes. My name is longer now, but I think I will make you proud of it. Connor smiled and leaned to kiss his son's hair. You do not have to do anything to make us proud. Just be yourself. Just be Tyler Hart Vega. And in that instant, under the honeyed light of afternoon, the broken pieces of their lives finally clicked into place. That morning, the little street where Nona lived seemed to glow with laughter, and the scent of food spilling from the kitchen out to the sidewalk. The brownstones' backyard had been dressed simply but beautifully with strands of golden lights strung between the oak branches and white cloths on long wooden tables. It was not a lavish wedding, nor was there a string quartet or a grand church, yet every corner of the celebration held the weight of real love and belonging. Connor stood before the mirror in his old room, adjusting a black tie with hands that trembled in a way that surprised him. He had faced danger and chosen life and death in the span of breaths. Yet now, ready to step out and speak vows. His heart pounded like a young man falling in love for the first time. The door opened softly and Tyler came in wearing a small, light gray suit and carrying a blue velvet pillow with 2 wedding bands gleaming on top. He stood straight and spoke in a wavering but jubilant voice. "Dad, are you ready?" Connor turned, smiled, and nodded. "With you beside me, I am always ready." Tyler stepped close and tugged his father's sleeve to straighten it as Nona had taught him. "You know, I never thought I would be the ring bearer at Mom's wedding with you." Connor knelt to his height and held the small shoulders. "And I never thought I would be given the greatest gift of my life right in front of me." "Thank you, Tyler Hartvega." The boy giggled and ran down to the yard to get in place. When Connor stepped out, family had gathered. Jay and Clara and familiar faces from the neighborhood. The chatter fell quiet as soft music drifted from the speakers, and Emily appeared in the doorway to the garden. She wore a simple ivory dress, her hair loosely tied with a small flower Nona had picked from the garden that morning. No veil and no sweeping train, and she had never looked more beautiful. Their eyes met in sunlight and flowers, with a promise that needed no words. Tyler walked first with careful steps, carrying the ring pillow like a boy entrusted with something sacred. When Emily reached him, Connor moved down a few steps and held out his hand, taking hers. "Do you know," Emily whispered as her fingers rested in his. "The day I ran from Rourke, I did not think I would ever believe in anything kind again. And I," Connor answered without looking away, "once thought a man like me did not deserve anything beautiful, but you made me believe otherwise." They spoke their vows under the old oak where Nona used to hang a swing for her grandson. No one read from paper and no one repeated after an officiant. They simply said what lived in their hearts with eyes wet and hands clasped as if afraid. Even a sliver of air might steal the holiness of the moment. When the applause rose after their first kiss, as husband and wife, Tyler jumped and wrapped both of them in a hug. "Now it is official," he cried, and laughter rippled through the yard. Nona dabbed at her tears with an embroidered handkerchief, then kissed her grandson's cheek and murmured, "Now I have a granddaughter by marriage and a great-grandson." Connor and Emily and Tyler cut the cake beneath the hanging lights amid laughter and clinking glasses and a flood of blessings. None of them needed anything grander than that. They only needed each other. A man once swallowed by darkness, a woman who had fled a nightmare, and a boy who once thought love was a luxury. Now they had found one another, and in that small backyard among family and friends, and the old memories, they began a new chapter with the simplest and most sacred words of all, "We together." Night settled gently over the familiar brownstone roof, the laughter and voices of the afternoon fading into soft echoes of memory. The house sank into peaceful silence, broken only by the autumn wind brushing through the trees and the golden glow still spilling faintly from the kitchen. On the balcony upstairs, where 2 wooden chairs sat side by side overlooking the garden, Emily and Connor sat close together, their fingers entwined. Between them, words were unnecessary. The quiet itself was enough to feel every heartbeat, every breath, every emotion still lingering after the most complete day of their lives. A soft wind stirred, brushing the edge of Emily's simple wedding dress. She leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, eyes fixed on the garden below, where Tyler had fallen asleep in Nona's arms after the small celebration. "I never thought there'd be a day when I could sit here like this in peace," she whispered, her voice slow, almost as if speaking to herself, without flinching at the sound of a car outside or a shadow moving past the window. Connor turned to her, his eyes so tender she felt herself melting into a dream that had finally become real. "You're not afraid anymore," she said again, this time as a declaration. "I'm really not afraid anymore." Connor tightened his grip on her hand, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin chain with a small round pendant engraved with 3 tiny initials, E.C.T. He fastened it around her neck, his voice a low murmur carried by the breeze. "I know you're strong enough to protect yourself and our son," he said, "but from now on, you'll never have to do it alone." Emily's fingers pressed lightly over his, tears glimmering in her eyes but refusing to fall. They were not tears of fear or pain, but the kind that rise only when someone touches a place too deep within the heart to name. Connor turned to face her fully, his hand lifting to her cheek as if to seal something sacred. "I swear, Emily Hartvega, he said in a voice that trembled with warmth. "By everything I am and everything I have, that I will protect you and Tyler until my last breath. Not out of duty, not out of debt, but because I love you, and I love him." Emily laughed softly through her tears, wrapping her arms around his neck and resting her head against his chest, as if every storm they had weathered had finally dissolved into dust in the rearview mirror. They sat that way for a long time beneath the pale starlight spreading across a sleeping city. No sirens, no lurking threats. Only two souls who had once been broken, learning to heal together. Below them, a single light glowed in the house, near the spot where Tyler's stuffed bear had fallen to the floor beside his bed. And on that small balcony under the open sky, the promise that bound them was not written on paper or witnessed by law, but spoken from a heart that had lived in darkness and chosen the light. That night, the first of their new life, Connor Vega understood that he was no longer the lonely man haunted by old ghosts. He was a husband, a father, a keeper of a home, and he would guard it, with everything he had, until his final day. The next morning, soft sunlight slipped through the window of Tyler's room. The walls were alive with drawings, shelves lined with children's books, and a small night lamp shaped like a spaceship still glowed faintly. Tyler slept peacefully, his breathing even, his small face serene in a way that said he no longer knew fear. For the first time in many years, he had slept through the night in his own room. No creak of floorboards from a mother checking in, no startle at passing headlights, no nightmares, no worry. Just the deep, undisturbed sleep every child deserves. Downstairs, the kitchen hummed with the soft rhythm of morning. Connor flipped pancakes with steady hands, while Emily stood beside him pouring coffee. The sweet aroma of butter and cocoa filled the air, mingling with sunlight streaming through the curtains, turning the kitchen into the beating heart of their new home. A few minutes later, Tyler appeared in the doorway, still drowsy, hair tousled but eyes shining at the sight of the two adults laughing together. He ran forward, hugging his mother first, then wrapping his arms around Connor from behind. "Good morning, Mom. Good morning, Dad," he mumbled. Connor turned, ruffling his hair. "Sleep well, champ?" "The best sleep ever." Breakfast was served pancakes, fresh fruit, orange juice, and smiles too big to hide. They sat together, talking about weekend plans, school projects, and planting a few more rows of vegetables in the garden. No one mentioned the past. No one spoke of dark nights, or the fear that once pressed on their hearts. They didn't need to. Those things were gone. What remained was the warmth of now and the quiet promise of tomorrow. When Tyler finished the last bite of his pancake, he looked up at his parents, his voice steady and sure. "We're always going to be a family. Forever." Connor and Emily looked at each other and said nothing, simply reaching across the table to hold hands, their fingers tightening in a silent prayer of gratitude for the life they had found. The story of Emily, Connor, and Tyler was never just about escaping darkness. It was about finding faith again, finding love again, and building a home they once thought impossible. And in a world still full of brokenness and doubt, this family stood as proof that sometimes the truest healing doesn't come from doctors or counselors, but from arms that know how to forgive and hearts brave enough to love again. If you're watching this story and feel something stir inside you, ask yourself, how long has it been since you held someone you love, really held them? Have you ever thought that maybe you could be the light for someone who's lost their way? Tonight's story isn't only about these 3 lives. It's a reminder that no matter how dark the past, every one of us still has the right to begin again, to find our home, and to write our own ending filled with hope. If stories like this one move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so that its message of love and courage can reach even farther. How did this story to make you feel? Did it remind you of someone you love? Or of your own family? Or someone you once met along the way? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. We truly want to hear from the heart of every listener. Thank you for spending your time with us. May your days be filled with health, peace, and gentle joy beside the people you love. Until the next story, take care and goodbye.